And you see calls from business people to governments to match the subsidies of other countries. So when the Inflation Reduction Act came out in the United States, a number of European executives were saying, well, we need to have similar subsidies here. What they didn't tell you is they already had bigger subsidies here before the Inflation Reduction Act. They wanted even more. So these are the types of shocks and shifts, I think, which interact with one another, which make prediction quite difficult. But also makes it very interesting to track what's going on and to try and understand it and interpret it.
Das ist der HSG Student Podcast. Mein Name ist Olli und zusammen gehen wir auf die Suche nach spannenden Geschichten und Persönlichkeiten von der HSG. Welcome to another episode in the HSG Student Podcast that now is called Campus Conversations, in fact. The podcast where we portray individuals from our campus to tell captivating stories, show the diversity of our campus, and where we try to foster, also a bit of mutual learning. We're still at the university, right? We're just starting a new semester, and to date, we have been primarily portraying students in our podcast. But in the upcoming semester, we will also, but not exclusively, of course, shift this focus to our distinguished professors and people behind the university. I'm therefore very happy that Professor Simon Evenett is starting off this little new series called Professor Series, if you want so, in the Campus Conversations podcast, in our podcast. And Professor Evenett, to give a brief introduction, is a professor of international trade and economic development at the Institute for International Economics and Applied Economic Research. In that time, he has, among other initiatives, founded the Global Trade Alert and recently the Crux for Capitalism initiative. But there are many others. If you follow his LinkedIn or go on the website, you will find out there are not only these kind of initiatives. These initiatives, though, have all been subsumized under the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity through Trade, and he has enjoyed education in economics at the University of Cambridge and Yale, where he also obtained his PhD. Before the University of St. Gallen, he held various positions at universities and was also a director at the World Bank. And since 2005, Professor Evenett is here, and I'm so grateful that you're here, that you made it today to our little studio in Square. Thank you, Square, that we can be here. They share a bit with us your passion for trade and economics as well as their studies. And I was wondering, you have so much experience, publications, positions. I was wondering, how do you usually introduce yourself? Because you could write a book easily about your career so far.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me on this Campus Conversations podcast. So, if I had to describe my interests, I would say that I'm an economist who likes to work at the intersection between business, markets, and public policy. And so if you thought of three circles which overlapped in a Venn diagram, I like to work right at the middle of those three circles. And that's typically where we learn a lot about what factors shape markets, what factors disrupt markets, how does this influence the choices that governments might make, and also the performance of companies. And so that is ultimately where I have done a lot of work. Now, it turns out that in the last 10, 20 years, a lot of that action has happened at the international level. Of course, it reaches into the national level. And so it's natural then that I have an interest in international economics and international trade. But really, that springs from my fundamental interest in how businesses, markets, and governments all interact with one another.
So with the semester starting, and we're now end of February 24, what is the things you're looking forward to in the next half a year, if you want so, in this regard, and probably also at the university?
So if you look forward to 2024, this is a year of elections. We have many countries, I think 60, are going to be holding votes. Some will be more freer votes than others. But the simple fact is we have a lot of very important jurisdictions where the government may change this year, or the head of government may change. Or they may be re-elected, in which case it'll be interesting to see what they want to do next. So if anything, I think this year is somewhat unique in terms of being a potential watershed in how governments think about globalization, integration, fragmentation of their economies with the world economy. And I think this might be an interesting turning point, possibly in the wrong way than in the right way. So I think at the global level, that's really perhaps the most important factor. Then we have, of course, some other really important things to keep tracking, such as the actual conflicts we have at the moment, and there's more than one. And we also have a number of sort of structural changes going on in economies, such as the digital transition, the climate change transition, and the move back towards more normal interest rates. And these are factors which I think will have a bigger impact than many people realize. So that's what I'm looking at the sort of national economic level. Then at high scale, well, the spring semester is the semester I get to teach advanced corporate tactics, which is actually a corporate strategy class, but it's applied very systematically to a series of companies and business situations, which are at the core of these interests I mentioned earlier. Where these are companies that often dealing with disruption or facing abrupt changes in public policy, and then seeing how they can react to them. So that's what I'm particularly looking forward to this semester.
And if you look at these developments you just described compared to previous semesters, are you more optimistic about what's happening or rather pessimistic? Or, as a researcher, sometimes you can also say you're agnostic and you're just analyzing. What would you say?
I think it's that there's an interesting mix of both optimism and pessimism. I do not share the overwhelming pessimism about fragmentation and the end of globalization. I think actually what I heard when I was at Davos this year suggests that companies are very, very determined to find new markets to replace potential lost sales due to perhaps geopolitical factors. So I think there's actually a very interesting evolution of globalization rather than it being seen as being in retreat. It's actually, I think, evolving. So there's an area of some optimism. Another area of optimism is actually looking at the sheer profitability of companies. And here the data shows very much that I think Q4 last year began the start of a global bounce back in profitability of companies, led largely by the American economy, which is doing so well. And so those are areas for optimism. Reasons for pessimism would be the potential for the wrong outcomes in a number of elections this year, bringing back a series of, I think, extremely mercurial populist politicians. And then the second area, of course, for concern is the conduct or the state of the conflict in Ukraine, where the build-up on the Russian side of their military, at least the replenishment of their military, has been much faster and much more extensive than I think people expected 12 months ago. And of course, the Ukrainians have had some challenges in terms of their counter-offensive against the Russians. And of course, the West is prevaricating a little bit on how much they're going to support Ukraine. And that is a potential source of concern as well. So there are good reasons for some optimism. There are also some things to carefully watch as we go forward. And of course, I haven't mentioned the Middle East, where the tragedy is just heartbreaking.
And, when you look at all these conflicts and difficulties around the world, is it affecting your work? Because you work a lot with data in all your initiatives. I think I feel like, some of these initiatives have been around for 20 years, I think, or even more than 20 years now. So I feel like you're a bit ahead of all this, AI and data, kind of big data thing. From my perspective, probably you have a different opinion, but is it, with all these conflicts going on, is it affecting your work currently or
well,
not?
Let me perhaps say the following, which is that there are very significant knowledge gaps, especially about the state of public policy at the international level. So in some areas of policy, this is not a problem. In the case of monetary policy and fiscal policy, the International Monetary Fund does a great job collecting and disseminating data. In the areas of trade, industrial policy, climate policy, there are very few centralized repositories of information and data. Same is also true in the digital economy. And so when you're thinking about some of the key trends that we have out in the world, which is potential for fragmentation, the digital transition, the climate change transition, it's actually quite difficult as a third party or independent observer to actually see what governments are doing, or at least coming to a considered opinion about the overall policy stance. And a lot of what I have done in the last 20 years has been to build initiatives which help shed light on important developments like that, so that I can better understand what's going on, so that hopefully I can make more informed presentations to students, to corporate groups, to policymakers. And so so you're absolutely right to say that I do put the collection of high quality evidence and information at the center of a lot of what I do, but it's done very much with a purpose to try and strengthen my understanding of these different trends.
And I think something that is new also to your career is you have been elected as the co-chair of the Trade and Investment Council at the World Economic Forum, WEF. And everything that you described now, and what you see at the WEF, I assume you participated as the co-chair, are these things, you mentioned also before, that companies are fine with this deglobalization currently, or they find different strategies to handle it. What else did you perceive there? Is there new things, or how did you see it?
So let me say a few things. So yes, in the past year, I took over as the co-chair of the Trade and Investment Council with a fantastic colleague, Sarah Thorne. And this has provided me an opportunity to listen to and meet a wide range of both public policy officials and senior executives. Now, at Davos this year, my sense was that when people were discussing the fragmentation of the world economy, or that is it breaking up into blocks, or the frictions that we're seeing, that I heard three different things. I heard the public policymakers being, especially on both sides of the North Atlantic, being exceptionally gloomy, about where things were going. And I think that very much the fears driven by national security considerations have been given probably far too much weight. Okay? Yeah. But still, this if you wanted the most depressing outlook came from normally the sort of the senior policymakers on both sides of the North Atlantic. The business community, on the other hand, understands that there is there are these tensions, doesn't necessarily particularly like them, but has a very different attitude. And that is, of course, business has to go on. The show has to go on. Salaries have to be paid. Suppliers have to be paid. Customers' needs have to be met. And so for those types of business people, when they see that maybe their sales to China might not grow as quickly as they had anticipated when they made their original corporate plans, then that just begs the question, where are we going to find where are we going to find the replacement sales? And so you're hearing a lot of companies talking about trying to supply underserved market segments, normally in the emerging markets, which are not aligned either with the West or with China. And so what you're seeing is, in many ways, an attempt to redirect some of the corporate energy towards underserved markets. And this will actually lead to more globalization, not less. So, and because they saw this as a prospect, they're a lot more optimistic about this, or at least a lot less freaked out about fragmentation. The third group of people, of course, who go to Davos are the analysts. So the journalists, the professors, the think tank types. And I think when they talk about fragmentation, quite frankly, they overthink it. And there are a number of occasions where a discussion was set up by an analyst and they characterized the dynamic in such a way that the business people looked at them as if they were from Mars. Oh. So in that sense, could you give an example, maybe?
Yeah.
So people were talking about fragmentation and then trying to get at the core of what they thought the rivalry was between different countries. And this is at some level, for many business people, just irrelevant. The fact is that it's the actions which are being taken and their consequences, right? And so a lot of the business people just thought I had the sense that they felt the analysts were overthinking it. That was a bit, that was quite interesting actually. What I took away from this was the incredible can-do attitude of a lot of people in the private sector. Really differentiates between the professors and the public policymakers who don't actually have to get stuff done, right?
Yeah, management decisions. I remember, I think this was one of my first management classes in my master's. Shout out to Harald Tuckerman. I'm not sure whether you know him. And I remember in the first class, he asked us, what is management? And everyone was like, yeah, analyzing data, leading people. And in the end, he was like, no one found the right answer, or just that boils it down to one thing. I think everything is kind of correct, but it boils down to decisions, right?
So, it's decisions and getting things done, translating those decisions to action. And the attitude of a lot of these executives seemed to me to be like the following. We start the year with 0 francs in the bank. We need to end the year with a lot more than 0. And we just have to get this done. We can't, sit around waiting for negotiating timetables, semester starts and ends. Yeah, they have to get on with it. And I think this induces a different type of thinking where there is always an eye open for opportunities, not just threats. And I think that was one of the bigger things I took away from this year's Davos. The other point which came through is that the relative pessimism of the public sector compared to the private sector. I think if you wanted to be a little bit critical of the private sector, you could turn around and say, well, look, 12 months from now, we could have Donald Trump back in the White House in the United States, in which case Davos 2025 is likely to be all talking about what does that mean, right? So there was a sense that maybe this is the calm before the storm. And so I think in that sense, some of the public policymakers who were thinking ahead may well have felt that the private sector was being a bit too myopic on that. Just so you know, for anyone you have access to this, anyone has access to this. On the Thursday of Davos in the afternoon, there was a session on what would a next Republican administration bring. And if anyone needs a short primer on where the Republicans stand on lots of issues, watch that panel, because it will probably blow your mind.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, because just give it a little teaser, something that blew your mind, because you're the one who could, or you want someone who could expect what will happen, but still blows your mind. So that's kind of interesting.
The sheer aggressiveness towards the Davos crowd by some of the participants was amazing. So you had the president of the Heritage Foundation, I think, a gentleman called Mr. Roberts, who said, look, I've come to Davos to tell you that if Donald Trump gets elected, we're going to shut you down.
Oh.
We're going to shut down the anti-globalists. We shut down the globalists. And then he went through and he tried to associate globalism with elitism in the US and the impoverishment of the middle class and the working class. So he made all sorts of connections, but he was being deliberately provocative. And then there were people there also talking about the national security side of what a Trump administration could do. And last week's comments by Mr. Trump that he would let the Russians do whatever they liked with underpaying NATO members. I mean, that went further than what we heard at that particular session at Davos, but was certainly consistent with the view of an extremely not so much inwardly focused, but at least self-aware, self-engaged United States under President Trump. One which, well, let me put it this way: one is perhaps the US that is less likely to honor its international obligations, or at least its international alliances, and that would be a big change. And
I'm also curious, because you mentioned it's a bit, the calm before the storm.
Mm-hmm.
Did you also walk away, with new questions that you intrigued to answer? Let's say, maybe the next year or in the future, something that was you didn't expect to happen, or you didn't expect to sense, or something that you're like, that's a new phenomenon I've never heard about. Was there something, because you probably get a lot of content, right, at these kind of conferences, and sometimes they're really high level and it's just kind of blah blah. But probably in the background, not in the official sessions when you talk one-on-one, there's probably new things that come up, and I'm interested to hear about it.
So I think one way to answer your question is to say that when you listen to a lot of these companies, you realize how much agency they have. They have lots of options, right? So if they're thinking about paring back their exposure to the Chinese market, they have lots of options for how to do this. They could have a China for China strategy. They could do a partial exit, or shutting down some revenue streams. They could partially withdraw from certain regions within China, which are more sensitive than others. And when you listen carefully to what companies are saying, they realize that the set of choices they have are often quite rich and that they're quite creative. You also realize that there's massive dangers in overgeneralization because companies are so different. So if you're running a factory in Russia or the Ukraine, it's very different from running a professional service firm, where the professional service firm can exit much more easily. And so you realize this, you're just reminded that business circumstances are very different. And that the private sector can be incredibly creative at trying to find ways forward. Again, I think driven by this pragmatic can-do attitude, and you do get that. It was the I don't want to say optimism, but the fact that they were taking this in, companies were taking a lot of what's happening in their stride, was not something I had expected, and made me want to understand more about that.
And what I think is really interesting, what I hear now from these first couple minutes we're talking, is you're really, when you said you're working at this intersection in the middle of the Venn diagram, you're really including both. I always thought, when you're interested in trade, you probably look at public policy. But you seem like to be really into both. Also, the companies, and it makes sense. But I feel like you're kind of not everyone is that interested in both. I think
that's right. It's true. I think that's fair. Most international trade economists are probably stronger on the understanding markets, or at least modeling markets. Some have a strong interest in trade policy, and some have an interest in firms, but mainly in the econometric analysis of firms. Very few people have an interest in all three, even though public policy is mediated through markets, which of course are shaped by firm choices. And so that connection is often a bit weak in a lot of economic analysis of trade flows. Yeah. So I think you're right to say that my interest in all three is somewhat distinctive. But I don't want you to think I'm the only one who's interested in all three. There are plenty of fine people out there who contribute to these discussions. And there's also, I should say, quite a lot of people in both government and in business who are sort of interested in how the others work too. So there's quite a useful exchange between these people, and those exchanges have become all the more necessary, especially when people raise things like national security fears, to be able to say or show how the private sector is already adjusting its risk management practices to limit downside risks from geopolitical foes. Actually is very useful, as it suggests that the governments don't have to do all the heavy lifting themselves.
I read on the website when I prepared for the interview, that you're an expert on I think it was the website of the University of St. Gallen. You're an expert on geopolitics, trade, and investment, and relating these to companies and governments, as we just heard before. Mm-hmm. But on a more theoretical side, maybe it's a silly question, but I'm kind of interested in how you would frame it. Is how are these three things connected? When let's say you have because they're so big topics, right? Mm. And they're kind of so formative for how the world is being run, I feel like. My sense is really you try to understand the world. And when you would explain that to someone new to the field or someone that comes to university, how would you summarize these three terms, geopolitics, trade, investment, how they related to each other? And that I'd be really interested in hearing, your kind of your version of the story.
So I think there's two ways to try and explain that. So one is, and perhaps what I would do if I were meeting some students for the first time or some corporate executives for the first time, would be to go through perhaps contemporary examples of important choices that either governments had to make or firms had to make. So you could look at, say, the decisions by firms to leave Russia, Western firms to leave Russia last year, and take people through what the different policy incentives were, both from the Russian side and from the Western side, and also the pressures from civil society and the campaigns in the media and alike. So one way to come at that problem is to use a real-world example and then highlight the different components and how they all link to one another. Another way, perhaps more foundational way of thinking about this, is that both trade and investment, or I should say international trade and international investment, reflect mismatches between consumption and production decisions, right? To put that differently, in a world where you have cross-border trade and investment, we don't have to align country by country all their consumption decisions with their production decisions. So in other words, if you like eating Italian food or Italian ingredients, you can. You're not confined to eating what is grown in Switzerland. And so when you see it that way, then you can begin to see that international trade and investment are about the freedom to be able to choose and allowing individuals, consumers and firms to source internationally enables them essentially to enjoy a far greater standard of living or quality of life, or in the case of companies, often a better selection of inputs, parts and components. So that's on the consumption side, the buying side. On the selling side, the great thing about sort of cross-border trade and investment is that it means that a country's growth is not tied to the growth of its national market. So you could have a small country like Switzerland, small in terms of population, maintain very high living standards precisely because it can sell in many other countries abroad. And so there, the ability to both trade and invest is actually supportive of living standards and of the good life. Now, of course, these cross-border transactions, whether it's by firms or by consumers, are also shaped in part by public policy. And in normal times, where there was no geopolitics, then this was largely a matter of seeing how a government saw its national interests or saw the key elements of the drivers of prosperity in their country. Now that we have a lot of rivalry between countries for the top position, or at least seeing how close you can be to the top, then this type of rivalry is shaping how governments are treating these cross-border trade and investment flows. And they're not taking such a neutral stance. In the old days, they would not worry too much about technology being sold to another country. But nowadays, there are some technologies, such as semiconductors and alike, where there are real controls and concerns because they do not want to see the technology ending up in the hands of a potential rival who may challenge their primacy. And so geopolitics then shapes the public policies which define the terms upon which trade and investment can happen. And so that production-consumption mismatch, which trade and investment help us get over, are affected by how governments see the perils or the benefits of engaging with other countries. Right? And that's where, and that engagement now is influenced not just by traditional economic considerations, but also now by concerns about the relative standing of a country vis-a-vis another country, or what some people call geopolitics.
And this sounds all very logical. How, from your experience now, you've been looking at these processes and aspects for many years. How is it easy to probably it's not easy to predict, but is it this time series analysis and extrapolation into the future, how things will happen? Is this something that is, because it's so logical, is this something that is easy to do or very difficult? Because in the end, sometimes it boils down to one or two decisions someone takes at the really top and you just can't look into their heads.
So I like your question. And one way that economic historians have tried to answer your question would be to say there are shocks and there are shifts. Shifts are trends, right? So, and to the extent that a trend unfolds relatively predictably over time, you would think that it would be possible to be able to forecast a little better. However, there are also shocks, that is disruptions that happen, and disruptions can happen for all sorts of reasons. They could be medical related, they could be weather related, they could be the election of a new government. There are all sorts of reasons why shocks happen, or it could be an invasion of another country. And these shocks then tend, almost by construction, are often relatively unpredictable. And they then interact with the trends that we talk about in ways which does make it quite hard to predict. And we see this in the data that we've tracked when we've been tracking, whether it's trade, investment policy, digital policies, that you do see just marked shifts in behavior over time, government behavior over time, which I think it would be hard to say people could predict. So I'll give you an example. When the pandemic hit in 2020, it was not surprising that you saw a lot more government intervention. This is typically what happens during a pandemic. The way in which pandemics have been fought has not really changed much in 500 years, right? You just need to keep people
confined
and away from each other. The support, of course, which governments give to economies has changed a lot in the last 500 years, but what the immediate implications are for production and for societal disruption are pretty clear. You might have thought after the pandemic began to subside in late 2021, 2022, we would see a lot less government intervention in markets. But in fact, actually, what we see is it increasing even further. So we have seen, certainly in the global trade alert data, there was a step up in 2020 and a further step up in 2021. And if anything, 2022 and 2023 are as active as 2021. And so we seem to have then moved into an era where there is a permanent, or at least if 3 years is permanent, a non-transitory increase in government intervention. Yep. And so the interesting question then is, well, is this going to be something businesses should be factoring in for the future? Some are clearly counting on it because thereafter, a lot of these government interventions take the form of subsidies, and those subsidies go to companies. So some companies which would dearly like this to be the case. Others perhaps are less keen on having to be able to compete with firms who have their national finance ministry standing behind them. So that type of change, I think, has occurred, and that's being internalized now. And you see calls from business people to governments to match the subsidies of other countries. So when the Inflation Reduction Act came out in the United States, a number of European executives were saying, well, we need to have similar subsidies here. What they didn't tell you is they already had bigger subsidies here before the Inflation Reduction Act. They wanted even more. So these are the types of shocks and shifts, I think, which interact with one another, which make prediction quite difficult. But also makes it very interesting to track what's going on and to try and understand it and interpret it for different audiences, students, businesses, public policymakers, journalists, other people at the university.
And one part where you do that is the global trade alert, right? You mentioned it before. Can you walk us through a bit what it means, because it seems like a huge task to monitor what's happening in terms of policy and trade. What do you look at? You probably look at the things they publish. You probably also talk to people, but how does all of this information, and I think it's 40 people that work on it. It's a global map of what's happening around the world in terms of trade. It's very fascinating. Everyone, I recommend everyone to check it out. How does it, how do you approach when you say, I want to analyze trade policy of country X, for instance?
So perhaps it's good to start at the beginning of the global trade alert, which was in 2009. You may remember then that the global financial crisis was well underway, and there were fears articulated by many government leaders that unless governments were careful, that there would be the protectionism we saw in the 1930s be revived. And this was universally seen as an undesirable outcome, correctly so in my view. It was decided to task the World Trade Organization with the job of monitoring governments. And there was a concern amongst some of us who are independent of government and independent of the international organizations. Actually, it was the concern of some in international organizations too, that governments would not share information with the World Trade Organization in a timely and accurate manner. And unfortunately, that worry was borne out. because governments did hold back information. And so I took the view, and I wasn't alone. There was another competing initiative which was proposed as well, that there could be and should be independent monitoring of what governments were doing, and that this would serve several purposes. One, it would help make governments accountable. Secondly, to the extent that more information was made available, it would help dispel suspicions. Right? And thirdly, it would also build an empirical database on trade policy intervention, which would complement the other trade policy data which is out there, and there's not that much out there. And so this would help then with a new generation of research, which hopefully would then generate a new generation of insights, which would feed ultimately into better public policies. So that was the intention. So we built a team here at St. Gallen, and we were supported by a number of external governments and the World Bank to track what governments were doing. And then initially, of course, we were using sort of going onto the internet, going onto government websites and tracking what was announced on government websites in that way, very manual. Now, over time, the team that we had came to me and persuaded me that it would be possible to automate some of this, especially the grabbing of information off government websites, mainly through scraping methods. And that it would be possible to grab that information and then have a trained human to assess whether or not an announcement on a government website was relevant. And so we started building systems which enabled team members to see very quickly what was going on in terms of new policy changes, to filter out which ones were irrelevant or announcements which were not particularly compelling, and then to focus on writing up the measures which were relevant. And we defined explicitly a methodology for doing this, which we've stuck to ever since 2009. And that methodology is transparent. It's on the website. And we would then process interventions in this way. And that's what we did. So if you fast forward to today, we do have, I think we track somewhere between 700 and 1,000 government websites each week. All the changes on those websites are then fed back here to St. Gallen and then distributed amongst a team of experts around the world who then review and process this information. They then follow the methodology which we have for tracking policy intervention, creating records which are reviewed twice before they're published. And so in this way, we've managed to build up the largest inventory of unilateral public policy intervention. And I should add, by the way, we're not interested in what governments agree at the international level. That's typically quite well documented, whether it's regional trading agreements or global initiatives. Where there was the big knowledge gap was on what governments are actually doing on the ground when they're acting on their own. And that's what we have tried to fill in. So if you fast forward to 2024, the Global Trade Alert website now has over 65,000 policy interventions documented. That's 5 times the size of the comparable database of the World Trade Organization. And our data is downloaded an enormous amount by all sorts of different users, interestingly, including some of the governments who are the most difficult about sharing information in the World Trade Organization. So, which goes to show to me that there is a strong desire to figure out what's going on in the world, but there's not much of a desire from some of the bigger players to share information. And so we have filled in this knowledge gap in this way and hopefully contributed to the public policy debates on this. It also helps businesses and business associations understand and appreciate what's going on around the world. It also generates data for researchers and also insights for journalists. So it serves many purposes. And I think what I learned from the design of that particular project is that it is possible to generate multi-year significant projects which have a number of audiences. And so you can have short-term wins, medium-term wins, and longer-term wins. And if you're a professor, you're in the market for all three typically. Yeah.
I have 2 practical questions to that. Number one is, you mentioned enormous amount of data. Do you have like a number or some that one can imagine what this means? Or
Well, I think that's why I shared with you the relative size of our database compared to the World Trade Organization's one, mainly because it is now a really, really significant database, and it's acknowledged as much. Even in 2016, the International Monetary Fund said we had the most comprehensive coverage. So that it's a huge database. If you want to think about it as as an Excel file, with not 65,000 lines, because if a public policy intervention affects 3 trading partners, it gets 3 lines. Okay.
Yeah.
So you are talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lines of data, which is then, and it's all available free on our website. Yeah. So this is available for any analyst to go and use, and a number of high school students over the years have used our data in research projects. So yeah, it's a significant database which is being used, and I think is now being cited or used in over 3,500 entries in Google Scholar. Wow. So in that sense become an important database for analysis and research too, which was, as I articulated earlier, one of my longer term goals for this was to be able to support researchers and analysts and students to be able to conduct more up-to-date, more informed, higher quality analysis on how governments treat trade and investment.
And the second practical question I had is, how do you deal with language?
So we have on our team, we have people who can speak every major international language. Oh, all of them.
Wonderful.
Yep. So every single language has been covered. And one of the most amazing things is to see how many young people are incredibly talented at speaking different languages. And what also is interesting is how quickly some people can learn languages, and how especially if someone has a skill of if they know 2 or 3 languages, they can learn a 4th and a 5th very fast. And that's impressive. I mean, I'm, as you can probably tell from my accent, British, and we're horrible about learning foreign languages.
Well, you learned the world language, so
right. We were lucky. I was born at a time where the language of my home country was one of the global languages. We might not be saying that in 50 or 100 years' time, right? Where if Chinese is the world language, so in that sense, the Americans and the Brits have had we've had it a bit easier. Yeah. Okay. Maybe the Australians and the New Zealanders too. Of course, the exceptions are the Canadians, who have a French-speaking part in their country. Right. So they are, I think, a lot more sensitive to this. But it is impressive seeing the language skills of many young people. And we see this at high school too. It's not uncommon to have students with 3, sometimes even 5 languages.
True. Looking at the time, I wanted to shift a bit more to also your career and some personal questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And the first thing is because when I looked you up and I saw so many initiatives going on, I would really be interested in that. I think some people in this podcast as well, certainly. Can you walk us through a day being Simon Evenett? What does that mean?
So we have to separate. When I think of a week, I think of Saturday as the day which I do not work. Okay,
not at all. No, 0.
Try not to work at all on Saturdays, and often will try and take Friday night off as well. Okay, Sunday for me is a very big day of work, and I do it precisely to get ahead of
everyone else
for the rest of the week, so that I know I have much of the week planned. I know what I need to accomplish, and I have thought that through. So yes, I typically work 6 days a week. In terms of when I get up, I think it's got later as I've got older. So I think when I was in my 30s, I was frequently getting up between 4 and 4:30, and in my 40s, 5 to 5:30. Now it's probably still 5 to 5:30, and I'm 54 years old. So I typically get up quite early and like to get some work done before everyone else has started, and then of course we have our university obligations here, which I happily do, and then often in the evenings we'll also do some work as well, depending what it is. And of course, you can't stay at peak productivity throughout the day. So you choose when you do certain types of work. So if I want to do very clear thinking and writing, then I try and do that early in the morning.
Because that's where the brain is the fittest, if you want to.
Yeah, for me, that is. Some people, I have some very good colleagues for whom they like working in the evening. I'm not like, they do their most original work in the evening. I'm not like that. I actually would rather spend time maybe reading or reviewing things in the evening. So it's still intellectual work, but not quite so demanding. So that's very much that's very much how I like to work. I think when I think about the peak levels of productivity in my career, have typically been also when I've been doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise. So nowadays I do a lot of cycling. I have an amazing electronic bike at home, which I use. But when I was a university student, I used to do a lot of swimming and squash and running. And I found that was very helpful in helping me absorb vast amounts of information. And that has actually been one of the that's one of the hallmarks of my career. When you're trained at Oxford and Cambridge and places like the Sorbonne and American law schools, they all have one very important thing in common, which is you are given a mountain of work to get through, to read. And so you have to become very fast at not scanning, actually reading
and understanding,
and then assembling information in your mind. And I found that I was able to do that very, very quickly when if I was also doing cardiovascular.
So you're on the bike and you're reading something?
No, I don't know that you shouldn't do, because that impairs that slows you down. Okay. That does slow you down significantly. So no, I stopped doing that. But I find that the forcing yourself to have a break to do the exercise, and then afterwards you're so much fresher.
Got it.
So that's very much the way that I have liked to work. I think I was also extremely lucky to start my career in the United States, where the expectations on graduate students for working, doctoral students for working, and assistant professors were extremely high. So when my first academic job was at the Ross Business School, which is at the University of Michigan, and that was in the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s, the senior faculty in my subject came to the office Monday to Saturday and on Sunday mornings. And then in the afternoon, they would go home and have lunch with their families. And then if some of their children were playing sports, they would go and watch them play sports. So it was, at the start of my career, it was made very clear to me that 6 days a week was the expected minimum.
Yeah.
And these were tenured professors with amazing publication records. And they were still coming in the office Sunday mornings. And it made very clear that if you wanted to compete in that environment, you have to show up. You have to show up. There was very little working from home at that time. And so I was very much exposed to that type of very highly demanding, intensive work environment. And that's where I think I learned saw the value in working consistently and hard, because you don't want to be like the old expression, the tortoise and the hare. You don't want to be like the hare who does a burst of work and then goes back and stops and then goes and does more. You have to do consistently over time. Otherwise, you do not accumulate a huge base of information that you can draw from very quickly. But you'll notice that one of the things my generation was expected to do was to read a hell of a lot. And I'm not so sure that subsequent generations are quite so keen on reading as much. But you push back. Feel free to push back. And I'm sure, and let's not overgeneralize, I'm sure there are some extremely diligent people who read a lot now. And I'm sure there were in my generation a number of people who didn't want to read at all. So, but I think the expectation there has changed.
And probably something that is also interesting for some of the listeners is to hear, now you had this already very intense career. It's going to go on, I believe, looking at what all the projects you have, if you had to do 3 or 5 goals for the next 20 years, what would be in there? I mean, personal, academic, professional, because there's also, you're switching to IMD, right?
Yes.
So probably there probably is an underlying reasoning for that.
Sure.
Too. So what is like the 3-5 hallmarks you want to achieve, or goals that in the future?
Well, I think I have goals for each of the major initiatives that we're involved with, right? So the first is that, well, actually, let me start with the even bigger picture. Yes, I am going to move to IMD Business School from the 1st of August. I will be a faculty member there, which means I will have been at HighScale for 19 years. And so have spent a lot of time here. And I will, I think, be retaining some ties here. Why? Because the St. Gallen Endowment, which we set up with the support of the Max Schmidt-Honey Foundation and the university, it will remain the St. Gallen Endowment. So it's not going to it's not going to change either title or legal seat. And St. Gallen, the university, HighScale is a co-founder and sits on the board. So there will be almost certainly some type of connection to St. Gallen. This foundation I think will then probably become more pan-Swiss. So it will have hopefully a very strong engagement with IMD, but also with potentially with the obvious organizations in Geneva, possibly the World Economic Forum, and if they want it, the World Trade Organization. So I think the endowment will change, and it will evolve into a pan-Swiss vehicle. Now, what will this vehicle do? Well, now we get to more specific goals. I mean, the Global Trade Alert is probably the preeminent independent monitor of trade policy. But I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting our data used by scholars and researchers and then generating the next wave of insights, which will influence public policy. Yep. And that, I think, will be an important goal for us. We also have the Digital Policy Alert, which is unique in that there is no international organization which competes with it. No international organization has been given the mandate to collect information on the laws and regulations of the digital economy, and the team that we have who tracks those developments just has done a fantastic job in the 3 or 4 years it's been operating. I think they just documented their 10,000th government policy intervention. And this is a project that is taking off, and I really want to see have a massive impact on how policy is discussed and analyzed. Then there is the Crux of Capitalism initiative, which I have developed over the last few years with some amazing team members. And this is a different type of initiative. Instead of tracking public policy, it tracks corporate outcomes, economic profitability, indicators of corporate distress. And we've been very active producing lots of notes on what this database can say to all sorts of different debates, like, is capitalism too concentrated? Are some firms making too much money? What is how much can firms contribute towards pressing global problems? All those things. And so that's the profile of that initiative I want to build as well. And then there is also the goal at the foundation and the St. Gallen Endowment to build a third pillar on something related to climate change and/or supporting European prosperity. And these are ideas that we're developing very extensively at the moment. This is something to look forward to. So those initiatives have to be taken forward. And then at the personal level, yes, I'm 54 years old. I will be 55 by the time I arrive in Lausanne. So I will have 10 years to build up a profile as a faculty member at IMD. And I think I will welcome the change, and I think it will rejuvenate me. It will force me to stay even more on top of business developments. I will engage with a different group of interlocutors, more executives, I suspect. And I think I'm looking forward to this. It'll be an exciting time. But as I said, I think I will retain some type of, I have to through the foundation. We retain some type of ties with St. Gallen. I think it's an open question as to how we build those ties over time and what interest there is at the university in maintaining those ties. I think these are all very open questions, but I sense a lot of goodwill and a lot of support. So I hope that something comes of this.
So a lot of points to stay tuned, I think. I have one final question for you because I think you need to leave later. It's kind of a teaser question. You published, I read, you published over 200 articles, books, and other publications, and probably, multiply that with all the initiatives, it's going to be way more. But if you had one publication left, only one, be it a book, an article, whatever, what would you put the focus on?
If I could write only one more thing, I would probably want to write a book on what factors are holding back the growth of living standards and prosperity. Because I think here in Europe, we have a very significant problem with slow growth, low innovation, and we have people who are very big ambitions for their lives, and who want to accomplish a lot. But we have economies which are not going to deliver at the moment the types of resources necessary to tackle all the challenges that we face, as well as allowing people to reach their aspirations. And so I think there is a need for a very serious rethink about where the European economy is going. And I don't want to I'm not going to pin the blame on anyone, because I haven't thought as much about it as I should have. But I think if you could think of a defining publication which would be the capstone of your career, trying to understand how we could revive growth and living standards in a way which clearly doesn't destroy the environment. How do we find a sort of climate-friendly, inclusive pattern of growth which brings along people rather than exacerbates the levels of division that we see, whether those divisions are geographical, generational, or between university educated and non-university educated people. I see a lot of fissures and divisions in society which a properly well-balanced prosperity drive should try and ameliorate.
Luckily, you can write many more publications that will probably inform this final or this only publication if you had left. I hope you find the golden bullet. I think it would be at the benefit of us all.
Yes.
What I know was that the benefit of us all already now is that you joined our podcast. I hope, for me, it was really interesting to see, and still the motivation and the eagerness, this force to still, this interest, this internal fire to still research all these kind of complicated aspects. So I hope we could win some students to check out some of the initiatives you're leading, Global Tailored Alert, Crux of Capitalism. We're all linking them, and everyone. I think. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you for joining, and see you soon.
Well, thank you. Look, thank you very much for this opportunity to join your podcast. I think it's a very timely way of communicating also with a big audience here at HiScape. And I know there will be, I imagine, hopefully some alumni listening in as well. So it'll be good. Look, thank you very much for taking this initiative.
Have a good time, and I see you soon. And everyone else, thank you for tuning in. Take care. Bye-bye.